Good evening, everybody. Looks like we're doing Rene Descartes, Discourse on Method, and we're at part 2. So part 2 will be chapters 4 to 6. Was a very interesting read, yeah? Nice and short this time.
Yep. Can I just follow up on something that I recalled after our first session on Descartes? So you know that we kind of all clocked that despite being a bit dismissive of the ancients, Descartes was actually using a lot of the thought processes and some of even the theoretical positions of some of the ancient philosophies. And what I recalled afterwards was throughout the 17th century in England and France, there was this kind of cultural dispute called the Battle of the Books. And what it was about was whether the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome were superior or whether the modern Christian civilizations were superior. And it kind of went on for decades, and different people took part, and different arguments were put forward on both sides. But one of the arguments from the ancients, as they call themselves, and they were the people who said that the ancient civilizations were superior in some ways, one of their arguments was, well, hang on, all you moderns are actually using the arguments and the thought processes and some of the theories of the ancients. And for the English-speaking readers, it kind of all culminated at the very end of the 17th century when the great writer Jonathan Swift wrote a piece called The Battle of the Books, and it's written as a kind of a mock newspaper report of actually books having this battle. And in the story, the volume of Plato is sitting up on the shelf looking down at the fray and saying something like, you know, all you moderns, you Descartes, you Hobbeses, you Gassendis, you think you're so amazing, but all your armor is taken from the ancients. And if we took that away, you wouldn't have anything. And so that was the kind of the idea. And so, yeah, it really was a thing. And I just wanted to say that, you know, Descartes didn't get away with dissing the ancients. There were plenty of people to point out that he was actually using some of their arguments and their theories.
It's really interesting, like that there was like such a strong dispute between that. And like, it is like, yeah, like we'll say, it felt so like anyone who sort of has had some exposure to ancient thought, it's like, yeah, like this is just ancient. It's not even like modified or, you know, it's just there. Like it's just sitting right there. It's amazing. Like that's interesting though. That makes more sense why he was so, obviously he was more on the modern side of things. Like, and that's why he was so strong.
Exactly.
Like his wording. Because it was like such a disputed issue.
He was one of the modern sort of like exhibit A's. And so in Swift's thing, The Battle of the Books, it culminates in this rather funny ending where Descartes, who's one of the shock troops of the moderns, gets hit in the eye by one of the ancients and goes sailing off into the cosmos in a vortex. And that was like a reference to his work on vortices. But also his early work on some of these things like vortices was partly because a lot of the Hellenistic engineering texts had suddenly been translated. So again, there was that influence. And finally, and I'll kind of leave this subject, but in the 18th century, when the first excavation started at Roman sites, basically the excavators had no idea what they were looking at. Because the Roman engineering was so advanced, they didn't know they didn't know they were looking at the drainage systems, the heating systems, the milling systems. They didn't know what they were looking at, and those conclusions weren't even drawn properly until the 20th century. So in a sense, the ancients were actually even more right than they thought in terms of the sophistication of ancient civilization. So that's just the end of that thought.
Well, just to continue that thought, because we don't necessarily have to go through this from 4, 5, 6 by the look of it. That occurs in 6, that little bit of a talk there around how people are limited by their adherence to the ancient philosophers. He says, this is on page 84 of the Penguin, so I don't know what page that is for you guys, but he says, and I am not in the least astonished at the extravagances attributed to all those ancient philosophers whose writings we do not have. And I assume he means there that people kind of say, well, wouldn't it have been great if we had access to Chrysippus, for example. Neither do I judge on that account that their thoughts were extremely unreasonable, so the opposite opinion, seeing that they were the best brains of their time, but only that they have been misrepresented to us. For one sees also that it has almost never happened that any one of their disciples has surpassed them, and I am convinced that the most devoted of those who now follow Aristotle would think themselves happy if they had as much knowledge of nature as he had, even if it were a condition that they would never have more. And then he has this lovely metaphor. They're like the ivy which does not seek to climb higher than the trees which support it, and which even often comes down again after reaching the top. So yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're saying, Judith, but it's also interesting hearing his opinion on that, because I could imagine that people would, maybe, I don't know, but you could imagine them saying, well, Aristotle had all the answers, so as long as I learn Aristotle fully and completely, and I can speak as if I was an expert on Aristotle, then that's good enough for me. And his idea of starting again and having an experimental method meant that he could go, one would imagine, and I watched the Sadler kind of show where he talked about, you know, being able to do experiments and build up a knowledge from a few basic principles and going much further that way towards developing practical utility in the world, like medicine and mechanics and things. And from that point of view, it's very interesting. From the point of view of crossing the bridge from abstract philosophy to practical use philosophy. Did anyone want to say anything about that? That's an interesting topic in itself, what Judith brought up.
Yeah, like, I think that's sort of that whole thing of the where people sort of hold up an ancient thinker as like, this is the person that got right, and like ancient, like person before that existed before them, not necessarily just the ancients. This is still something that we see today. Like you'll have people who will be like Hegel, like St. Augustine, or like, you know, obviously the classics of Plato or Aristotle or something, and they'll go, yes, like all of this was right. I remember like listening to someone, and they were like, they'd read Hume, and it was the like one of the few philosophy books they'd read, and they were like, why did anyone do any philosophy after this? It seems like Hume's pretty much got it all right. It's all been sorted now. It's a pretty strong thing. But yeah, like this sort of idea, like there is something attractive of the you know, because it's that older thing, like stood the test of time and all that sort of stuff. But you know, sometimes can be faulty because it just happens that it's just survived because it got popular in its time or something like that, or someone popular within our recent time has like endorsed it or something like that. But yeah, it is interesting that that's like, you know, it's not something we've sort of escaped.
And don't you guys think it's probably interesting, given the context of Galileo and those sort of characters, that it was sort of risky to kind of challenge the ancients and you know, Copernicus, for example, I think one of the reasons that his method proved kind of a failure at the end, you know, in terms of where he wanted to go with it, was because he was bound to this idea of perfect shapes. And so he stuck resolutely to Aristotle's, you know, idea that, you know, the God would be a circle or make the universe in a circle or whatever, and had no concept, of course, as a result of being stuck with ancient philosophy, to think about different possible shapes like ellipses and things like that. I don't know if, to be honest, probably Descartes would have committed the same error because he's talking about perfect shapes in here. So I don't know what you think about that. It's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I think like within Descartes, right, we'll probably get into it, but there's some parts where it's just like I've like commented next to it, why question mark answer Christianity, like, because some of it's very Christian assumptions, and it's like, but there's so many other possibilities. Why are you just going like this is what it is. And like you've given this whole thing before that of like, oh, I'm doubting myself whether I actually exist. But now all of the good like Christian doctrines, those are that they don't need much of a conversation about that. Like it's just sort of taken as the assumption.
Yeah. Do you guys want to stay with 6, or do you, now that Shannon brings it up, do you want to go back to 4 and actually work through what the principles are as they're presented? Because obviously, I think that's what Shannon's talking about there. Does that make sense?
4 was probably the only one that I really had a lot of comments on.
Yeah, okay. Did anyone outline them clearly? Obviously, first comes the indubitable opinions, but did anyone actually write them out so we can kind of track them? Not really, because I just highlighted the text. Lots of highlighting.
You got to highlight the whole text, otherwise you don't know.
Let me see. Yeah, well, I basically did. So I'll see if I can recall. You guys can jump in if I miss anything. And luckily, I only watched the Sadler thing not so long ago. So basically, first he has this idea that of doubt, right? Like I could doubt that I have a body. I could doubt that the world's real. I could doubt that I'm real, possibly. But one thing I can't doubt is the fact that I'm doubting. So he comes up with this idea: if I have like a clear and kind of certain perspective or whatever notion, right, that thing must be true, right? And because I can doubt myself, because I'm doubting, there's got to be somebody there who's doubting. I think I'm muddling that up a bit, but basically, because I'm doubting, I can't make that bit disappear. I can't make myself disappear. There's somebody there who's doing the doubting. That's a fact. So it's something that you can know, that's undoubtable. And that goes to the something more broad than doubting. Doubting is part of the method, but more broadly speaking, there's somebody thinking, and that's what the doubting is. So I think, therefore I am. I'm a thinking substance. And from thinking, then, what comes next? Is it the God bit?
Yeah, he kind of goes pretty quickly straight to the God bit, because as he says on, this is page 19 of the PDF, and so it's section 33 to 34. So he's conceived that his, and this is a bit of an interesting move too, because he is doubting, he has inferred that he is not perfect, because he saw clearly, he tells us, that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt. So then he had to search for the source from which he'd learnt to think of something more perfect than he was. And that this had to be from some nature that was more perfect. So, and then it gets a bit odd, or a bit, a little hard to follow, because he says he has thoughts of many other things, such as heavens, earth, light, heat, and so on. And he says he has no trouble knowing where they come from, which was a little surprising, but I guess he means that they are dependencies of his nature, so they've come to him through some sense perception or some kind of perception, maybe. But the idea of a being more perfect than his own could not be received from nothing, and could not be received from something less perfect than he was. So it had to be from something more perfect than he is, which, as he says, in a single word, is God.
God.
Yeah.
And in a way, when it comes to geometry, right, we can have a perfect circle mathematically or other geometrical shapes, but we generally can't find them in the world. But we know what a perfect circle is. How can we know what these perfect things are if we can't find them according to our senses? Well, they exist because a more perfect thing exists, and that more perfect thing is God. And because he says something like, because we're less perfect than God, that means we occupy a space between perfection and nothingness. So we partake in nothingness. And that means that the things that we grasp, the ideas that we have, are not illusions and they're not false. They're just muddled up, confused. They're real because they were put there by God, but because we're imperfect, we don't put them together properly in our own experience. And so that means that the ideas that we have of things have an innate kind of quality to them that, you know, they're based on true things. And therefore, he's saying, if our ideas and God and all that are real, are there, that means obviously that we can trust that the world's there and that my body's real and everything else is like that, because the God wouldn't fool us. The God is not a deceiver. The God. And that's what Sadler was saying. If you get rid of God, then you lose the foundation for the idea. It's a circular kind of problem, because then it undermines the basis for which you can take your reality to be real. That's kind of an interesting problem. But standing outside of that, one thing that I think is quite interesting is that it's reminiscent of the Platonic idea and the Stoic idea of innate ideas, you know, the preconceptions, because it's got this idea for them. I want to see if you guys agree with this, because at least in A.A. Long's version of that book, Epictetus, the Stoic and Socratic way of life, he says something like, when we have an idea of the good, and this is a bit like the way Descartes using perfection, when we have an idea of the good, we know that's really based on really good things, because we would never confuse good and bad, for example. You just, when someone says, well, it just occurs to you that there is such a thing as the good, like good things must be real. You just know that there is such a thing as good, and you could never confuse it with something that's not good. Well, at least the opposite of good. And so the idea there is that we can't ever find that in the world easily for the same sorts of reasons, because we're misled. Our ideas about the good get in the way. They're jumbled up, but nonetheless, there's this innate conception of the good, which is basically a little bit like what Descartes' doing. It's grounded on something more real than our experience in the world, sort of thing. Something like that. Is that, how do you guys see any of that?
That's great. But I'm just worried if we get too far ahead. There's just a paragraph to do with this. Going back a little bit, it's on my page 54. So if we go back a bit, Judy, where you were up to about, that is to say, in a single word, which was God, right? That's where you were just about up to there. And you go back to the beginning of that paragraph, and then you go up to the paragraph before, which starts after this, I considered in general, or just before that. So I just want to take us back there just before we go too far forward, because this is where he starts to say that the soul and the body are separate, because he says, I thereby concluded that I was a substance of which the whole essence or nature contains in thinking, and which in order to exist needs no place and depends on no material thing. So that this I, that is to say the mind by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body, and even that it is easier to know than the body. And moreover, that even if the body were not, it would not cease to be all that it is. That's a remarkable statement to say that, and to state it with such certainty that that is the truth and nothing else will be entered into. That's,
good point,
that's the point. That's the point at which he's really making that claim of divergence, isn't he?
Yeah, and so our translation of the PDF, where you said the mind through which I am what I am, our translation's got the soul through which I am what I am, and is entirely distinct from the body. And well, so I guess what he's drawing from there is kind of, I suppose, classical Christian theory, although, as I've recently learned, it was remarkably late that particular view of the soul became sort of standard for, you know, there was a long time where, well, there was a period at least where some Christian thinkers went along with the Stoic idea that the soul was corporeal. But this is more of a Platonic or a Socratic view from the Phaedo, that the soul will persist after the death of the body, which was eventually what became standard Christian doctrine. But yeah, he does kind of he does kind of assume it. He kind of goes there very quickly and without much supporting argumentation.
Because he's not even considering that, you know, because he's speaking from a live body and he can't speak from a dead body. So, you know, like he's making a big assumption there. That's all. Not that I know any better either, but I'm just saying, you know, it's a big jump. That's all.
Yeah, I totally agree. I underlined that same quote literally, and like similar points. Like it was like, wait, how did we get here? Where are you going? Like before that, he's like trying to lay out an argument, and obviously, like it's a relatively brief text, so it's going to be fairly quick in the argument. But he's giving an argument for, I think, therefore I am. And then this is just like thrown out. It's like he has this whole questioning of whether his self exists. That it's like the self exists. Oh, there's also souls, or like maybe mind. Like depends how you translate it. There's souls and there's bodies that exist. Like they're also there. Like yeah, but they just come along, and it's like wait.
But I
Why?
guess,
Like there's nothing there.
well, there is, because he's saying if you're going to follow the method, which he's laying out as the how he managed to establish these principles, he says the first thing I did was doubt everything. So I doubted that I had a body. I doubted that there was a world. I doubted there even existed a God. So what could I know? I knew that I was doubting. Who was doubting? This thing that I am that is aware, thinking. But I'm not aware of my body in the same way that I'm aware of my mind. My mind is this lively thing. I can see it. You know, I'm experiencing it all the time in terms of memory, imagination, thought that's going on. It feels like me in a way that my body does not feel like me. My body, I don't know what my body's doing.
Legit? You know, is that legit though, Courtney? I mean,
if you follow his method, it seems legit.
Well, maybe, but maybe not, you know. And then he goes into all this, as I mentioned in Facebook, you know, all this detail about the circulation of the blood. It's like, hang on, why are we now so concerned about bodies? You know, you weren't very concerned back here about bodies. And so I agree with Shannon. I don't think he's legitimately got to this point through his method. I think he's argued away the body without it really doing so convincingly.
But
Well, it's
if
just
he's
that
saying,
he says, sorry.
I just want to say just quickly though, if he's saying we can only start from things that we have a clear and distinct idea of, well, I guess his point is, and I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the method either, but if I'm following it along, he's saying I have the clear and distinct impression of myself as a thinking being. But
he has.
I don't have the same kind of clear and distinct understanding of myself as a body. There's, you know, like, I don't know what's going on in my stomach right now, for example.
The only thing that I'm taking up here that I think is a little bit dubious is that he says that even if the body were not, you know, even if the body were not, it would not cease to be all that it is. So he's saying that the mind or the soul can exist without a body. He doesn't know.
He doesn't know that. You're right, Jody. And Socrates in the Phaedo took a great deal of care to say, well, I don't know about this. Nobody knows about this. I wouldn't be sure about this. You know, that's real doubt for you. That's actual skepticism or sort of uncertainty, radical uncertainty about these matters. But Descartes has moved to a certainty that's kind of unwarranted in the situation, it seems to me.
Well, I agree with that because that's another move, right? Fair enough. Maybe the mind is more real than the body if you use his method. But what he wants to do also is to prove the immortality of the soul, which is, I agree with that. That's a bit, he's obviously jumping straight into that. Once he proves that God is real, then the soul's immortal, you know. Well, because God gave us this soul or whatever, then it's more, I don't know, more perfect than the body, and therefore it's immortal or something like that, right?
Yeah, but I sort of wanted to pull us back just a little bit to the first page, because even this whole thing of I think the I am, like, to me, it feels like the I is doing a lot of work there. Like, it's sort of flipping. Like, there's the I, like, I can talk of I as in I'm referencing, like, me in some sense. Like, there's the experience going on. Like, it's just a pointer. But there's the I as in Shannon, the person, like, which is a lot stronger sense of I. And to me, it feels like he goes from the argument, I think, only works to the soft sense of I, to the identifier, like, to the pointer, to, like, there is something that exists that thinks, therefore that thing does exist. I don't think he's the way I sort of feel like his movement is going is like, there is this pointer that exists, therefore Descartes, the I exists, which is like a stronger point. Because like he's yeah, like, because like you could have like, you know, you could be like a thought that exists in another person, and like we wouldn't describe a thought or experience that's occurring in another person as an I. Like the I is to be an object. It's to be like a complete object in some sense, which, you know, maybe it's a bit like a bit fuzzy, but there's some sense where that is the case, where we would talk about them as an I, like, or like if you were like the schizophrenic experience of a crazy person, and that's what your existence is. Like there is some sense where there's like a thing you can point to that is having experiences, that is thinking, but it's not correct when it says Shannon is. Like, because there's not really a Shannon. Shannon is just the delusion of crazy Shannon. And that's what it sort of, yeah, like which I do think that the body stuff is a bit weird, but even before that part, it's a bit like, wait, we're going a bit further than I think this can take us.
Well, that seems to be the problem when you get rid of God, is that you could be deceived. It could be a dream, or you could be insane. It kind of potentially opens us up to a kind of solipsistic kind of version of Descartes. Descartes wants obviously to ground the world in the fact that God is real, and he's the one who keeps it real.
I wouldn't agree with this. Like, I know Descartes makes that point, but like God could have morally sufficient reasons to create the world in such a way, like, so that doesn't. There's no like I don't see you get a pass on this.
But he's not a moral creature, I think, in the same way. I mean, Sadler makes that point. It's like a God who's a mathematical God in a sense. He just sets the laws into motion. He's not tinkering with you and messing with you in that kind of personal way. And why would a perfect being like that, like a mathematical kind of entity, if you like, why would it go out of its way to deceive you? It just presents a world that is a reality, and it's real.
Yeah.
It's also, no, you go on, Shane.
Yeah, well, like generally when, and maybe this was different at this time, and Sadler made this distinction, but generally when a Christian's talking about a perfect God, they're talking about like the omni characteristics. So omnivolence is part of it. That's why I was bringing up the point of morality, because you could have that, like these would be like the defense of problems of evil sort of things, where it's like, well, you know, God allows pain because it's required for soul building, or it's required so you know your body's being damaged. Like there's morally sufficient reasons why those things are allowed. And that's what I meant with the point that you could just be a thought within someone else's mind, or a like an imagined person or something like that. That God could have like morally sufficient reasons for that. So it doesn't, I don't think you can escape that. Like it, you know, there could be, his ways are not our ways. Like there's,
yeah, sure, but obviously Descartes not thinking that God is like that when he's talking about God.
in the sense that he doesn't, you don't think he would hold to like the omnis, like the
No, I mean this meddling God, or that it's not perfect in this other way. And Sadler did make that point. He was sort of saying, I mean,
doesn't necessarily have to be a meddling God though. Like that's just the way the world's set up.
But anyway, maybe.
I think Judith had something she was going to say as well.
Now
I
I've
cut her
forgotten, so that's okay.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. But I tend to agree with you, Shannon. I think the eye is doing a lot of work here, that and then because it's doing all that extra work, that somehow allows him to get further along the path than he would if the I were just a something less than he himself, with all his identity and all his memories and everything else. So yeah, it's all rather, it's all rather artificial, I suppose, is the bottom line.
Yeah, there's this feeling that something goes wrong. There's no doubt about that. And that's what we've talked about a few times, haven't we? Like, it makes sense, like this method where he's doubting, he's looking for these certain ideas that what does he say? These perfectly clear and distinct ideas. He's looking for them so that he can establish certainty about what's true and not true. That all sounds really good until he gets to the point, after he establishes himself as a thinking thing, that therefore he's separate from the rest of the world, and he disconnects himself, he uncouples himself from the world and goes about his investigation from there on, which is actually really effective as a scientific method. And this is the thing we always refer to, and the phenomenologists talk about, obviously, is that such a method, creates this disconnected ego that surveys reality, is no longer embedded in it, which inevitably creates this idea of man's dominion over nature. And maybe that was already always there, but specifically we've conceived of ourselves. And reading this, I thought of Foucault again, because it was talking about how it's man's obligation to do these experiments so that we can dominate nature, so that we can be in control of things. And that becomes the ethical norm, as opposed to being in nature, as part of nature, as caring for one another, as communities who are embedded in things. It's a very different worldview, and it has different consequences, even, because look at the technology we got today as a result.
Yeah, just one other quick thing. So these first few pages are probably the ones where I have the most things. So even that quote before Jodie, where she's quoted where in our translation it goes, "From this I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is simply to think, and which in order to exist has no need of any place, nor depends on any material thing." So the way I would read this is as a conclusion, and it's like the material thing he's not established in that argument. The essence thing as well is a bit like, wait, like, which I guess like does kind of get to my point of like, he could be the psychotic experience of another person or another thing, like, which is outside of his understanding. Like he's going the whole essence. It's like, wait, why? Well, that doesn't, like, what you've been arguing there, just, it's sort of, yeah, just, which I guess like just adds onto the probably similar points that would raise in the next sentence that we already did, where it just feels a bit like he's kind of jumping it. And before there, it felt like, it, even though I disagree, I think the I thing is a bit problematic. It does feel like, he's sort of building towards something. And then it's like, he's just like, okay, now I'm going bang, bang, bang. I was like, wait, we were going like, slow, steady. Let's like doubt everything. Let's build everything up. Like, yeah, I'm on board. And then we're just going to like speed run the last part and just say they exist. It's like, what?
Well, that's right. And you're right, Shannon, to draw attention to that sentence, because I think that should make us all go, well, hang on. Because we can pretend for the sake of argument, and that's exactly what he's done, of course. We can pretend for the sake of argument that we are not terrestrial mammals born from a terrestrial mammal mother and a terrestrial mammal father. We can all pretend that for 5 minutes, but we all know that we are. so you know, to prescind from that for the sake of a thought experiment is not to prove that we're not the product of a pair of terrestrial mammal parents. It's just to do a thought experiment, you know. So yeah, I do have difficulties with that too.
Yeah, but again, it's a method, and like I see this in the same lineage of, you know, Foucault's ideas about spiritual techniques or whatever. So, you know, this idea that the Christian spiritual technique was to look inside and to find all your dirty secrets and then confess them to a master who would absolve your sins or whatever. That was a method, and this method is to start out with clear and concise ideas, to doubt, to notice that you're a thinking thing. Once you've established that, well, I know what it feels like to be this thinking thing, this is a spiritual exercise. From that point of view, I can see my body as almost just furniture that I'm riding around in. That's how it feels. So it would feel like it's a completely different substance. I'm not saying it's true, but as a spiritual exercise, then he can go out and do, instead of looking at it, say, as modern science, he can do this kind of purification of his thought content. You know what I mean? I mean, that's how I see it. But I'm one of those guys who, when I read something, I can't help but agree with the author, unfortunately.
You know how he has this fear and paranoia of the church and being misread and being persecuted possibly for stepping outside of orthodox beliefs of the day. And you know, and we know just in the view from above, we know that he ultimately was responsible for this dual approach of science, divorcing the soul from material things, so that he could safely, in a sense, talk about physics or do experiments in science and medicine and meteorology and things like that, and without to divorce it in a sense, to then remove his ability to be chastised by the church. So really, this is just part of his overall agenda, isn't it? Like, it suits his agenda to separate them, because he needed some way really to move forward and be able to justify his work in the sciences and not be, because he even starts off chapter 4 by saying 3 years on, 3 years ago, like he says, it was 3 years ago when he says 3 years on, people, because this is 3 years later from when he wrote the earlier stuff, people he defers to disagreed over a physics matter that had been published earlier and was possibly prejudicial to religion or the state. Like, he says that straight up at the beginning of chapter 4, before he sort of divulges to us this incredible piece of reasoning. So, you know, it was I just feel like he was really, really trying very hard to argue his way out of any trouble.
100%. And I think you're absolutely right, Jodie. So to draw attention to his real world concerns, you know, it's these very real world agendas that have shaped his decision to pursue this strange thought experiment where he pretends that there is no real world. I mean, yeah, it's ironic, to be honest.
Yeah, that was because, like, I never because I only ever read Descartes. I never read people analyzing him, which is always a different experience. And this is something that Sadler made, and like I call in the video, where he was saying, like, oh, like his original his status in terms of his religion is something that's in question. So I didn't know that before I watched the video, and I'm not sure what that is, which, like, it does also make me wonder, like, does he just put this in just to, like, you know, tick the box type of thing. But it's hard to like personally, like for myself, I wouldn't make that judgment because I've not looked into the history, and it's just easy to be like, oh yeah, no, he's doing that because that's my view. So, you know, I'm smart. I want to be associated with Descartes and say that he has the same view as I do on God. But like, there are people who legitimately are intelligent that have this view, like, and even more eccentric views than this. But yeah, no, it's an interesting thought.
But I think we should be careful not to say that he goes out of his way to make the world disappear and not exist, because he's kind of saying later on that you can put forward these principles and you know, and talk about causes and effects. Sometimes it's looking at the last part where you can go back and prove the veracity of the cause. So he's really saying, it might sound ridiculous, it's a hypothesis. He talks about hypotheses later on, and it's a hypothesis, that's all it is, and it seems mad, but he has every intention of proving that the world is real and it exists and the body exists. He just does it as part of his method to establish his principles.
Yeah, I saw it as a dichotomy. And Judy, you were sort of saying it was, he sees it as not real, but I was meaning that he does have this dichotomy between the real, like the real, and the metaphysical world.
Well, there's two substances. There's a mental substance and a physical substance. And as Sadler was saying, apparently the mind or the soul somehow talks to the body through the pineal gland, you know, and fiddles around. Sadler says, like a joystick, fiddling around with the joystick, controlling the body or whatever. So yeah, and that's the problem. And I think that problem comes up later with the Swedish queen. Didn't she ask about this? How is it possible that the two can interface with each other? How can the mind control the body? It's a really big problem for that Cartesian dualism. If we really do have this separate I, this cogito, how is it that I'm able to conduct my affairs in the world? Like, how does that control that? Like, is it just like a man in a ship, or, you know, like, it's not that straightforward when you think about it.
I can see the time, and I don't want us to miss out on going through the full thing. But like I said, my interest is really in this first one. So just quickly, like some points that I found odd was that he says, for I saw clearly that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt. And that, I get very confused when Christians talk about perfection, or religious people talk about perfection. Because to me, like, it just always feels like it's the theology talking, not like an argument. It's like and maybe there is like an argument behind it, like it could absolutely be ignorance. But it's like, why is it better? Why is it a more perfect thing to know than to doubt? Maybe like a combination of the two is actually perfection. Like, who are we to say as imperfect creatures that, like, you know, at least 1% of doubt is better? Because like you could have like something like, say, open theism, where they'll go, well, God doesn't actually know the future. He's a really good predictor. He has a pretty good idea what's going to happen, but he doesn't know exactly what decisions people will make.
But if that was the case, next time you do your statistic assignment, just don't do the last calculation and say a certain degree of doubt is better than actually giving you guys the answer. We don't really care how many people went into the supermarket on Sunday.
But that's when you're bringing in like your limited view though of the world, like, because we exist where like these things are going to matter. But if you exist, which maybe he doesn't take the timeless, like God is timeless, but at least say immortal, ever existing creature as the perfect being, like the interests are just completely different. Like, maybe that little bit of doubt is just like, that's what actually makes it a bit better. Like, it's different for us because like there's going to be like impacts and stuff, but you can't have an impact against a perfect being, or like maybe it's fairly limited and like controlled impacts.
But I guess by doubt you mean a lack of knowledge or a limit to knowledge, right? So, for example, you're thinking about a God who produces the world, but he doesn't know what's going to happen. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, or it could just make himself not know.
But this God obviously is perfect because it produces a world knowing exactly what it's doing and what the world's going to be like at every given moment, and does everything according to a perfect plan.
Yeah, I would agree that that's probably Descartes' view, but I'm not familiar with Christians at this time. One other point, which I'll sort of skimp over, was the next line, which is that I decided to search for the source from which I learned of something more perfect than I was, and I plainly knew there has to be some nature that was in fact more perfect. And like that to me is like, why? Why does there need to be a source? And why is it knowable? Like these it just seems like, you know, it could just be unknowable. Like it's a thing that can't be accessed. The reason why I know that he thinks it's accessible is because it's in the Bible. Like in the Bible, at least the cynical bit of myself thinks that.
But if it,
But I think
If
you're
it-
right, Shannon, to the extent that there does seem to be an almost cynical deployment of conventions around God here, right? You know, it's like, oh, we're going to say he's perfect. We're going to say this. We're going, you know, we're going to go along with this convention because then I can say this. It's almost like it's very formulaic in a sense. And so he's prepared to argue to the nth degree about some things, but not about absolutely key things like the perfection of this deity. So, you know, it's, yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I mean, I mean, I guess it's, as Jody said, he was walking a line between what he could say, what he couldn't say. He didn't want to finish up like Galileo and unable to do what he wanted to do. So yeah, there were all these real world considerations, but one result is we have these kind of rather formulaic attributions to the deity being presented in the light of his own insights, if you like.
That's true, but also think about it pragmatically. Like he's got a method, and part of the method works because God's real, so therefore God means that the world actually exists so that his method can act on the world and explain it. And he goes about using a method by which he then goes and explains the world. So God better exist, otherwise what is his method doing? You know what I mean? Otherwise he's not sure at all that he's actually looking at anything with any degree of truth. So
yeah, but
there's a pragmatic side to this too, isn't there?
But that's where the disagree. Like, but where we're at this point, like in his argument, this is where he's still trying to present the idea of like, okay, like God, I think therefore I am, therefore God. Like this is where he's going to that therefore God part, like to build up that case, and it just feels like to me as like a very outsider Christianity, it just feels like very, very Christian and like very limited with considering other possibilities. I just wanted to like jump on this because I know I've sort of taken up a fair bit of time and I appreciate that. It's just it's in the same paragraph, but just a few sentences down. So he's basically saying, these the long sentences are still in this. I should have highlighted it.
That's why I end up highlighting the whole book, because the sentences are so long.
Because I like reading this, I'm like, wait, what was the actual thing? I'm trying to quickly read back. Oh, yes, this is where he sort of starts off with saying, yeah, I've thought of these many things outside of me, such as the heaven, blah, blah, blah. Had no trouble knowing where they come from. I could believe that if they were true, there were dependencies of my nature insofar as it has some perfection. And if they were not true, I obtained them from nothing. That is to say, they were in me because I had some defects. And he sort of has like also refers in the next sentence about the idea of nothing. And this is like such a like, because the nothing is like a really hard concept to like actually relate to what that actually means. Like, would logic and possibilities exist in nothing? Like, I don't know. What does it even mean to say they exist? Like, I don't know where I'm going with this. That's what I'm saying there, but
I think Augustine had a similar approach, right, Judith? You remember from Confessions, there's hierarchy of substance. So God was the most perfect substance, so in a way, the densest of all possible substance. And as you approach nothingness or no substance, it loses its substantiability in a sense. And if seen that way, if that's what he's talking about, apparently Augustine has that view, then we live somewhere in the middle. So we have substance, but it's not as perfect a substance as what God has.
now I remember what my point sort of was. I was sort of trying to think of it through while trying to read the quote. Yeah, because it relates to that next sentence, where so, but the same could not hold for the idea of a being more perfect than my own. For it's a manifest contradiction to receive this idea from nothing. But it just seems such an odd, like, that the nothing, like, is such a weird thing. Like, it seems like you could have access to plenty of things. And like, I don't think that's the only option as well.
You lost me.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't know
think
exactly.
we probably have to move on though.
Yeah,
because-
sorry.
No,
I'm
but I
getting to
think you're
rambling stuff.
right. There is so much in this one paragraph that are kind of, it's like he's kind of going through the motions to a certain extent. You know, he's going from A to B to C to D, and you know, don't worry about that over there because we're just moving on. And yeah, you're right to draw attention to it, Shannon.
May I just ask you which paragraph you're even in, because I'm really lost. Is it how does the paragraph start? Can you just tell me that one? How does it begin? The whole paragraph that you're in, Shannon? Is it in?
Following this reflection.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yep.
But it's about the third sentence, which of course will mean it's about halfway down the page.
I know where you are. I know.
See, I actually like this argument. I know we want to go ahead, but to me, I mean, I don't know if I like Descartes, but I like this argument. I don't have a problem with it. Like, it's cool. He's basically saying, if you imagine it like a gradient of substance, where there's the fully dense, complete substance at one end of the scale, and the other there's nothing. It gets more and more spread out and insubstantial until there's no substance. Well, it means that the ideas that we have, and those ideas are a kind of mental substance, don't come from the nothing end of the scale. They come from the God end of the scale, which is substance. So they might not be perfect substance in the sense that they're not as intact or, completely made, solid, because they also have some part of the nothing in them, because it's halfway between nothingness and something. I like that idea because it means that our ideas inside of us that we have about all sorts of things, about goodness, about whatever, everything, are actually based on something that is true. If God exists, that's how his argument's going. If God doesn't exist, because we don't like the God thing, then there's no such thing as this substance idea. And then our ideas could just be nothing, like what you're talking about. They could just be fictions of whatever pops into our head. I think it's kind of neat. Anyway.
But where I find like the confusion though is when you're saying there's a halfway between nothing to like the full something, and the middle way is it has a bit of nothing, but it's something in it. But that doesn't make any like sense. Like, to have nothing is to be like nothing. Like, there's not a like we think of, well, at least like mentally for myself, I always think of nothing as space, but I always know every time I think that's completely wrong, and that's not nothing. That's absolutely something. Like, so I don't know what it would mean to have something that's the wording on this, have something that's the full something to the nothing, and you have a halfway point where it's half something, half nothing.
Sure, but clearly he's talking about a hierarchy, and I guess that was the way that the ancients thought of these things too, right? There's a hierarchy with God at the top, and it kind of goes down from there.
Well, not all the ancients. And so this is where I think the Stoic system has a lot of things going for it ahead of this kind of thing, because when you know, the idea that soul and body are really both different formations of pneuma, of the same kind of thing, in attention, tonos, depending on things like that, you know, seems to make a whole lot more sense than having two completely distinct kinds of substance that somehow interact with each other at some arbitrarily selected point. So I think, as I say, that the Stoic corporeal concept is streets ahead of any dualist kind of approach.
Absolutely. And I think this is why this is so cool to read, because anyone interested in Stoicism will think, I wonder how I can marry Stoicism and phenomenology, because phenomenology is maybe a very strong critique of Cartesianism, and also has that same idea that we're embedded in our world. So yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I think the phenomenologists really make a strong point when they say, well, look at the modern world now, because this is a consequence of this kind of method where we've taken this kind of perspective of ourselves as against nature, working to dominate it. I think that's a really interesting project. Hopefully all of us would-be Stoics can go and rescue the world from the clutches of the dualist.
Can I try and push us forward just on the thing? Only a little bit forward.
Yeah. If we could just have a quick look at each paragraph quickly, you know, just so that we can just know that we've covered each paragraph.
Don't worry, I'll probably be stopped talking up. Like
we can't help ourselves.
So it's between 35 and 36. It's going like where he's trying to consider like God's perfection, and he says, "Thus I saw that doubt, inconsistency, sadness, and the like could not be in God, since I myself would have been happy to be exempt from them." Is a quote. And that one, like, because this is where he's trying to sort of, you know, he is trying to use his method, but why is his personal opinion of what he would be happy with relevant to the perfect being?
Yeah, I totally agree. It's so arbitrary. It's like, again, he's just like picking up different ideas and just folding them in and just moving on.
But isn't this just another critique of that whole, I'm not a perfect being, and therefore I can imagine a perfect being, so therefore there's a perfect being out there? And we see this sort of method being applied elsewhere, where they're trying to cure the emotions and the passions and make yourself not sad and, you know.
And just, sorry, in the final couple of sentences of 35, where he says, and again, it comes back to this distinct substances thing. But since I had already recognized, you know, so he's already got past this stage very clearly in myself, that intelligent nature is distinct from corporeal nature. Well, okay, you actually just assumed that, but anyway, taking into consideration that all composition attests to dependence, and that dependence is manifestly a defect. Is it really? I judge from this that being composed of these two natures could not be a perfection in God, and that as a consequence, God was not thus composed, but that if there are bodies in the world, or even intelligences, well, hang on, no, you've already established that there are certainly intelligences, or other natures that were not at all entirely perfect, their being had to depend on God's power in such wise as they could not subsist without God for a single moment. Okay, so now we've got a theory about constant persistence being dependent on the constant persistence of God, which again seems like a bit of a leap. You know, how have we got to this point? But here we are.
But a step back there, because that's interesting, the idea of dependence. Again, it's a dualism, so good, bad, dependence, independence. And if we were perfect beings, then we wouldn't be dependent. We would be independent of whatever. You would imagine that's kind of where he's going with it. And in a sense, it makes you wonder whether he gets this idea a little bit from the Stoics, because the idea of reason as the divine part is somehow independent to a degree from whatever's happening in the world for the body, you know? So in a sense, you've got that independence versus dependence dichotomy that modern Stoics especially love to capitalize on. Whether it's there or not, it's definitely something Descartes talking about.
But the other thing is, having just been reading Nussbaum on the Epicureans, why couldn't God be a completely independent? He might be perfect, but why couldn't he be completely? Why would he necessarily want to implant ideas into our minds? Why have we got to that point? Why couldn't we conceive of a perfect being who has no interest in implanting ideas into our minds? That's what it seems to me. He seems to have, again, because to your point, Shannon, he's attempted to deduce what turns out to be a very Christian kind of God.
That's a good question. Why did the Epicurean gods create the world? Did they?
No, they didn't. The world was a creation of atoms in the void by random activity. So in that sense, it's kind of similar to some modern views. So yeah, the Epicurean gods were not created gods. They were just there.
Well, there you go. That gets rid of their desire to care, whereas the Christian God created all this and he created it according to a plan.
Yeah, but sort of moving it forward, because I could definitely talk more about these sections, but seeing as I'm moving away from the sections which I actually care about, I'll now try to drive us through this book.
Can I take us to
the
the last paragraph then of 4, or am I jumping too far forward?
Oh, just a bit too quick. I was
Okay.
just going to say in that next paragraph, the one that starts, I set out after that to seek other truths. So he's moving on now. He's decided, yes, I've proved that God exists. I was going to seek out other truths. At the end of this one, he says, this is where he brings up the triangle. This is just this analogy to the triangle. And he's saying that basically you can have a perfect triangle, therefore you can have a perfect God. It's that easy. The last sentence of the paragraph is after the semicolon, and that consequently it is at least as certain that God, who is this perfect being, is or exists as any geometric demonstration can be. So again, that bringing it back to the mathematical purity.
Yeah, because you might not find the perfect circle in the world, but you can definitely prove that it exists with mathematics.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't like these arguments either, but I don't like maths, so.
If you go into that next paragraph too, if you go to what persuades many people that it is difficult to know this, if you just go down maybe about 6 or 7 lines, there's a bit there that I'm a bit puzzled by, is that they never, but what persuades many people that it is difficult to know this, and even also to know what their soul is that they never lift their minds above tangible things, and that they are so accustomed not to think of anything except by imagining it, which is a mode of thinking peculiar to material objects, that everything which is not within the realm of imagination seems to them unintelligible. I do. Can you?
Yeah, so that
help me there?
That section, I feel like it's one of those ones where it's like what does imagining sort of mean in this context? I feel would be important. There's one sense where I can agree with it, where if you think of someone who's like, oh, I can't imagine that, so it's not true. And this is sort of like, not in a philosopher sense, but you sort of, and I can imagine people like this in my life, that they just don't have much imagination in like the everyday meaning of that. Like they're just like, oh, I can't understand it, therefore it's false. And that's, in that sense, I sort of agree with it.
But isn't he just talking about 2 different kinds of reasoning? Like there's pure reason, which you use mathematics to work out, like your triangles and circles and things like that. And then there's the imagination, which is based on sense perception. So you've seen things in the world. You can imagine a pink elephant because you're just cobbling together ideas taken from the world. But you can't do that with maths. You can't imagine mathematics. You have to discover it.
I suppose that's what he's saying, but it's a tricky paragraph, combined with a sort of an unwarranted slur on other people. So because I don't get why he says at the start of 37, these other people who think that it's difficult to know this and even to know what their soul is. Well, isn't that what we're all about here? Isn't that what you've been doing? Trying to establish what your soul is. Why is that so contemptible? But anyway, that they never lift their minds above sensible things, and that they are sensible in the sense of sense perceptible. That's what sensible means in this context, I guess. And that they are so accustomed to consider nothing except by imagining it. Okay, isn't that what we're all doing? Isn't that what you're doing? Isn't that what we're doing here? And which is a way of thinking appropriate for material things. Well, no, it's a way of thinking appropriate for non-material things. Everything about this sentence is surprising and and dare I say it, unintelligible.
But isn't this just the unreliability of the senses and a real critique of empiricism, basically? He's a cognitivist.
No, it's not. I don't know what it is. I'm not sure what he's critiquing, except obviously other people.
I think you're sort of drawing in other ideas, because like this idea that mathematics is not imagination, like it is. Like that's like when you're dealing with mathematics, it is like it's hard to explain, but just take my word for it. Like there is this imagination element. There is like this sort of, it's not rational thinking, it's like creative thinking. There's so much that goes on with it. Like it's just not it's not like this hard, press button, go through sections, plonk out the other side. Like there is this art to it, like in the narrow and broad sense. Like yeah.
And that's what he's saying, because he's saying that everything which is not within the realm of imagination seems to them unintelligible. So he's saying, well, so you could reverse that and say that everything that is within the realm of imagination is intelligible. Yeah, so he's accusing those people of not being able to use their imagination. Is that what it says?
Well, I don't know, Jodie. I don't know what he is accusing them of, and I don't understand it.
And there's sorry.
And then he has the gall to say in the next sentence, this is obvious enough. Well, no, it's not obvious. It's not. It's really not clear to me. And I think he's actually muddying the waters here. I think he's having a go at these unnamed other people, because these are kind of very, very uncertain areas.
And it's like he's like at the start of the thing, he's doubted himself. Like I think Courtney, you were trying to bring up this point that like there was I can't remember what it was, but there was some pragmatic elements maybe. But it's like he's not coming from the pragmatic point of view that like, oh yeah, obviously I exist. Like, we can just pragmatically take that. Like he's coming at it, and I think he does like I said, have some problems, but perfectly fine way of going about it. But then it's like he sort of wants to go back to this idea of like, oh no, but it's just obvious, like we don't need to think about like whether we actually exist or anything like obviously we do. And it's like, no, you're taking away the fun part.
Yeah, but
like,
this last part of that paragraph, this is evident enough from the fact that even the philosophers hold as a maxim in the schools that there is nothing in understanding that has not first been in the senses, in which, however, it is certain that ideas about God and the soul have never been. I just take it as that view, which has obviously been around because it occurs in Boethius, for example, and that either the mind is a blank slate at birth and it's sense impression that inscribes things upon it, which is criticizing here, or that the mind has access to ideas that exist beyond sense experience, i.e., God and mathematics, and imagination in the way that they're using it here, at least, refers to empirical kind of worldly things and the sense of them, and that they're built through a psychological thing of experiencing them and encoding them somehow. He's against that. That's all that I think's going on there.
Yeah, you're right, because then he goes on to say, whereas a few more lines down, he says, whereas neither our imagination nor our senses could ever assure us of anything if our understanding did not intervene. So he's really championing our understanding there, isn't he? You know, he's lifting that above imagination and senses.
Well, I guess he is, but imagination is a kind of a, you know, if you're reading earlier on and you don't realize he's trying to make that distinction, and again, without knowing what the French word that he used was, but yeah, it's again, every step of this kind of theorizing around perception and knowledge was contested at the time, and yet he seems to be, again, assuming every step of the way that what he wants to conclude is true. Yeah, I don't know. It's just frustrating because he says this is obvious enough, you know, certainly, or whatever. Yeah, none of it's certain, as he has been at pains to do for the previous 4 sections. And yet now everything's clear and everything's obvious. It's just weird.
And it just doesn't have the rigor of mathematics. Like, that's the other thing that's frustrating about this. Like, Courtney, I know you're saying that, like, oh no, this is a mathematical, but it's just like, obviously, like, you know, there's 400 years difference between us, so maybe like the sense of what it is, but it just feels so off from what it is. Like, if I read someone like Wittgenstein, I'm like, okay, like, if someone said like they're taking up a mathematical way, like a highly rigorous way of arguing, it's like, yeah, no, I can see that. Like, that makes sense. And it feels like at the start he's sort of going that way, but then like when it gets to these other parts, it's like, where's all the rigor gone? Where's all the gusto about geometry and we're going to be so rigorous? And it's just like, let's get through everything. Also, I know it's 8:15 at the moment.
That's all right.
It's quite passionate, so it's whatever we're doing is working.
It's fine,
so
don't worry, Shannon. Doesn't matter.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I've gone through the part that I wanted, so I didn't want to be greedy and like.
That's all right. But he
No,
goes
I
on then
think
after that.
There's
Sorry,
so
go on,
many
Courtney.
good arguments in there. That's all. It is quite.
Because then he
interesting.
goes on to talk about dreaming and how we come to know things in dreams, and compares how we come to know things. He says, such a long sentence. Where did it start? One cannot deny that there are not sufficient grounds for being absolutely assured when one observes that one can in the same way imagine being asleep, that one has another body, and that one sees other stars and another earth without there being anything of the sort. So when we dream, we can dream anything, can't we? For how does one know that the thoughts which come while one dreams are false rather than the others, seeing that they are often no less strong and clear? And may the most intelligent men study this question as much as they please, I do not believe that they can give any reason which would be sufficient to remove this doubt, unless they presuppose the existence of God. Again, bringing it back to, you know, that even, you know, the unreality of dreaming, you know, that isn't.
Yeah, the point is, because it occurs in the meditation book, that when you believe that God exists and that he's perfect and perfectly good, he will not deceive us. So we couldn't possibly be in a dream, and we couldn't possibly be deluded by our senses if God exists.
Why not?
Because God is perfect, and he would create a world that is predictable and so
predictable for him, though. Yeah.
Like,
because that's the thing, that's the point I'm trying to push you on. Like, that it's this whole idea of like it's, you know, like, maybe the word deceive, like, that's morally loaded, but misrepresent, maybe, like, you could say we'll at least agree, like, obviously our senses are incorrect, like, we don't get access to the full world.
Yeah, so what sees the world clearly? That's the argument. No,
but the point I'm trying to make here is
reason.
There's things that we have within our everyday world where we do agree we don't have access to the correct world. Like, in some sense, we're deceived. So why not, like, God could just think that, like, and that could be for the better. Like, that could be the best world. The best world is the world where we're deceived.
Yeah, I guess if you go that way with this argument, the whole thing falls apart. If God doesn't exist, or if God is not the kind of God he's talking about, then yeah, it doesn't work. That's true.
But he wants to he's trying to argue for that type of God, though. It's not just like it's not like, oh, if we assume that my God's real, this is the case. He's like, no, this follows. Like, this is the case. I've definitely proven this.
Yes,
like,
I mean, if we go back to Socrates, he doesn't postulate a benevolent God putting weird ideas in our heads all the time. He says, in the Meno and some of the other dialogues, well, we can have well-supported belief about things. That doesn't and even though we acknowledge that sense perception is misleading or can be misleading, and that we don't have the full story, we don't have to postulate a God who's telling us what's, putting weird ideas in our heads, or not weird, but putting ideas in our heads which are either true or not true. It seems to me that there's nothing self-evident at all about a God who's putting notions in our heads. And yet, all throughout, Descartes is asserting that there is something self-evident about that.
But then he also frames it like as though it's he's argued for it, which I think that's what makes it so like, why you do it, like, especially that part that Jody was referencing in previous.
But interestingly too, he takes a very Socratic stance throughout. He's like, you guys all saying that the ancients had adequate knowledge, basically. I'm the one who doesn't know, so I'm throwing that all out and I'm going to start again. Basically.
Yeah, and that's what's the sleight of hand about it, Courtney, that Shannon and I think is, he's pretending to throw everything out the window, but retaining the expedient Christian God. Well, why?
Well, I think he doesn't have a choice. He would be burnt at the stake for a start.
Yeah.
So he has to make sure that God's still there. I mean, he'd have no chance of being able to publish it for a start.
But does the stake really exist? Like, has he actually proven?
100%.
No, but he needs to prove it from first cause. Sorry, I'm just making a joke.
Well, obviously he does believe in whatever God. He must do to bother. But if he didn't believe in God, he wouldn't have even approached it using this kind of method, for example, because he would have disproven that the world is reliable, So
I don't know whether that's necessarily true. Like, that was the point I was making before, that like I'm not saying that it is actually the case. I lean towards him being legitimate, but he could have also just put this in just as like a, don't burn me at the stake.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, similar to what
and that's what inevitably makes it seem a bit cynical, if you see what I mean. It's like it seems expedient, it seems convenient, it seems cynical if we need to go that far.
But I think it becomes too problematic for someone like Descartes. If he really didn't believe in God, he wouldn't have chosen this method. And that's kind of the point that everyone makes about the Cartesian circularism, that if you lose God from the picture, it challenges the hypothesis before it. It all falls apart. So I don't think he could have applied this method if he had any serious objections to the idea that God was real. He wouldn't have done it. He would have come up with something different.
I don't see the problem, like why that would be a restriction.
Because for this argument to work, for the world to actually exist beyond doubt, because he starts off doubting everything, the only way he can get the world back to being real is by making God the perfect being who ensures that the world exists, and the body and everything else in it, and ideas which we have. If God doesn't exist, then all of that still remains in doubt. There's no way out of that part. Yeah,
but like, if we're taking like as a assumption that he doesn't actually believe in God, maybe he is actually like a skeptic. Like, there are people who have met who are quite happy saying nothing is real. I don't quite understand what they're saying, but these people do exist. and it would make sense that they would have existed in Descartes' time. So that could just be his position.
No,
And
he doesn't use that position. He says that's rubbish, basically.
No, I know, but this is in the hypothetical world where he actually doesn't believe in God. Like, I don't think the fact that you shouldn't view arguments with getting you where you want to go. Like, there are people who they'll have the argument, they'll follow it through, and then they'll be like, oh, well, that's what it is. Like, we can't know about this. Like, I don't see, I just think the idea that if he didn't actually believe in God, he wouldn't have made this argument. Like, he could have made it and had many other reasons. Like, he maybe had personal solutions to this, but he knew he couldn't write them down through fear of retribution. This is getting like well and truly into the fan fiction writing area of things, but yeah.
And to put the fan fiction aside, don't you think really one thing that he's trying to do is coming up with a practical way to use philosophy and science so that he can focus on things like improvements in the practical part of science, like medicine and mechanics? That's what Sadler says, for example.
Well, how is it related, though? You could do that without going through this elaborate thought experiment. And, I mean, and of course, William Harvey, who had established the circulation of the blood, it's not recorded that he went through elaborate thought experiments about God before undertaking some experimental work on the circulation of the blood. So, it seems redundant, if not perverse, to go through all these preliminaries just to get to the same point as William Harvey did.
Well, I think the answer is the one we keep going around in circles with, because if he doesn't do that, then it kind of endangers his method. If he starts out doubting and going, well, I don't know if this method would actually result in improvements in science because it's not based on anything that's a fact. Well, hang on, there's things I know for a fact. I know the world's real and the ideas I have are real if they're clear and precise, because God makes them so,
And he goes into that in the next bit where he again brings up nothingness, Shannon. Do you want me to just read a little bit there, just to clarify? He says, I'm just after that. Sorry, where am I? For firstly, even the rule which I stated above, that I held, namely, that the things we grasp very clearly and very distinctly are all true, is assured only because God is or exists, and because he is a perfect being, and because everything that is in us comes from him. Whence it follows that our ideas and notions, being real things and coming from God, insofar as they are clear and distinct, cannot to this extent be other than true. Accordingly, if we often enough have ideas which contain errors, they can only be those which contain something confused and obscure, because in this they participate in nothingness. Aha, there it is again. That is to say that they are in us in this confused way only because we are not completely perfect. And it is evident that it is no less contradictory that error or imperfection as such should proceed from God than that truth or perfection should come from nothingness. But if we did not know that all that is in us, which is real and true, comes from a perfect and infinite being, we would have no reason which would assure us that however clear and distinct our ideas might be, that they had the perfection of being true. And can I just finish with this last sentence after that? But after knowledge of God and of the soul has thus made us certain of this rule, right? He comes back to that rule again in the next few pages. It is a simple matter to understand that the dreams we imagine when we are asleep should not in any way make us doubt the truth of the thoughts we have when we are awake. So he's bringing up that idea of dreaming again.
And again, he's just concluding what he wants to conclude. He's raised the issue. Now he says, no, that's not a problem. We just know. We just know. It's like, okay. And in a sense, after all his thought experiment, we come back to the same point. We just do exactly the same point as if we hadn't had the thought experiment. We're all sitting in the room or whatever. It seems an elaborate way to go about getting to the first, getting to the starting gate of doing some experiments, which seems to be what the whole point of it is.
I was wondering if Shannon, you could maybe to take it from a different point of view, like let's assume that you start out with doubting and you find out that there's no such thing as a God. And so therefore there's no way that I can really ground the world in any kind of, certainty that it exists, because I've already called it into doubt. So how do you then go forward producing a science or a mathematics when you can't guarantee that the mathematics that you think are real are actually in the real world, or whether they're just made up fictions in your head? How would you do that?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So probably first, I don't understand this leap where it's like God, therefore certainty. Like I don't get that part. That just doesn't.
Well, forget
make
about
sense.
God for the minute. Let's call God just the I don't know, what would you call it? Like the opposite of a solipsism. Like if there's that thing that he's trying to prove is really trying to negate his doubts. So if I can doubt, for example, that I'm sitting here looking at a computer, talking to you, I can doubt that 1 + 1 = 2. Maybe I've made mistakes all my life. Maybe there's something in the world that is completely deluding me. I'm a brain in a vat somewhere, that kind of idea. How can I then, if I don't know that the world is real, I can't prove it, how can I come up with a way to move forward so that I can develop like math, I don't know, anything, science, for example?
Yeah. So I have two things. One, like the way of like looking at science is like these definitive answers. Like it's just not how I view science or mathematics. Well, maybe mathematics, but with science, it's not. I just don't have that view on it.
Yeah, but you do experiments, and the experiments are done in such a way that they produce reliable results because there's a consistency to the world. You make a hypothesis, you set up an experiment based on, and then you make more predictions, and you find out whether or not the experiment turns out to fit the hypothesis, or you reject the hypothesis. But you don't have a situation where sometimes the experiment works and sometimes it doesn't, not because of any clear explainable kind of thing, but because reality is whimsical, for example. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. You wouldn't be able to move forward if you weren't able to establish a method that was based on something like certainty.
Yeah. So, well, like where I see it sort of going down to is like logic. Like that's what it comes down to. And I don't understand what it would mean for like God to be required. Like he sort of sits at the wheel of logic and he's like turning the gears to keep it going. Because then it's logic being contingent on something is then going to mean it's something different from what I would view logic as. Like if there was something
what do you mean by logic?
Excluded middle, I guess, law of identity.
But that could all just be made up. That could just be something that pops in your head because someone's squirting a juice onto your brain in the vat and to making you believe that that sort of input actually makes sense in a meaningful way.
So that it would be both X and not X?
No, it would just be some unknown outside influence making you think that logic was a real thing.
But that's like, I don't think you can escape because like you're already sort of using law of identity. Like, so we've already got, there's a thing, there's me. So there are like, but saying A is A, like Shannon is Shannon. And that other thing is the other thing. Like that law of identity already exists.
No, you only know that you exist because you're the only thing that you can experience.
No. But this is just like to get the key thing though, it's just so like logic, like it just seems like it is. And it just seems it just doesn't, being charitable, I don't understand what people mean when God is required for logic. Like that just, it just seems really strange because like if God is actually required for logic, like it's a contingent thing, and it could have been otherwise, that is like really weird. Like it just doesn't seem like we're talking about logic anymore.
Yeah, and sorry, also, and this is not quite what the point there is, but a somewhat related point, and certainly related to what Descartes is doing here, is why is what we have in our dream, you know, we've all had the experience about dreams, and we cannot, that's intuitively compelling because we've all had dreams where we wake up and we're not sure what day it is or whatever. But why does any of that have any implications about God? You know, why does our mental state at any given moment, why does anything to do with that imply anything about God? That's what I don't kind of get.
Because the whole, you know, when you go right to the end of the chapter, that's how he finishes it up, basically saying that waking consciousness is more valid than dreaming consciousness. That whole last big sentence.
Yeah, and we didn't need God for that, you know, we just woke up. So that's where, in a sense, the God he's postulating is sort of is redundant to the human processes that there are what he's talking about, except he's decided that God is not redundant for these human processes, but not explained how God is critical to these human processes.
The only thing he brings up really about this sleeping waking thing, the dreaming wakeful, where he says, for finally, whether we are awake or asleep, we should never let ourselves be persuaded except on the evidence of our reason. So he brings it back, all of it.
Well, which is a bit rich when you come to think of it, right? A bit rich at this stage.
And he even accents it. He says, and it is to be observed that I say of our reason and not of our imagination and our senses.
It reminds me of like when I listen to like what I would consider poor debaters, where they talk a lot, and then when they get to the end, they're like, well, I've proven this, this, and this, and this. And like, because they've said a lot, it's hard to like keep track of it all. But if you like go through it, it's like, you haven't done any of this stuff. You just, you know, stomping on the ground saying that, yes, this has been done. I've proven this. Why are you not accepting that this is the case? And it's like, oh, okay. But, oh yeah, so Courtney, now that you're back, so look, here's one hand, here's another. So there exist at least two external objects in the world, therefore the external world is real.
Sorry, you lost me.
Here's one hand. We agree this is one hand?
Yeah, but I could be dreaming that your hand is there.
Zoom works, so God exists. I think we've got that, so perhaps we better move on.
Well, can I just say that all our ideas and notions must have some basis in truth, for it would not be possible that God, who is all perfect and true, should have put them in us unless it were so.
So your hands could only be there, Shannon, if God made it so.
He has to turn the little wheels for the logic to keep going.
So we're up to part 5. Is there anything that really jumps out of you real quick? Because we've only got like 20 minutes left.
Well,
there was a bit about automatons in here that I thought was interesting. Is there anything else that anyone else found interesting?
he just goes on and on and on about the blood, which we don't need to.
Well, even just before that, at section 43, which is on page 24, and he's got the gall to say, thus I describe this matter and try to represent it in such a way that there is nothing in the world that seems to me clearer and more intelligible, with the exception of what has already been said about God and the soul. But I even explicitly suppose that in this matter, blah, 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 blah. Oh, sorry, then it's the next sentence I really meant. Moreover, I showed what the laws of nature were, and without supporting my reasons on any other principle but the infinite perfections of God, I tried to demonstrate all those laws about which one might have been able to have any doubt, and to show that they are such, that even if God had created many worlds, Epicureanism again, there could not be any of them in which these laws fail to be observed. So there's your issue around logic, Shannon. Logic is the same in all possible worlds, according to Descartes. So what role is there for God again? But, you know.
How far in is that, Judith? Can you just give me roughly what number?
It's about halfway down page.
Yeah. Oh, well, how many paragraphs are we in? Put it that way.
Well, it's number 43. So it's halfway down page 24 in the PDF.
Yeah, I'm
It would
sorry.
be about this. It's like the second page, about in the middle.
Second page about the middle. Okay.
Yeah, the top paragraph. Gosh, his sentences.
It's a long paragraph. This
It is, yeah. So the paragraph starts. It's the second. It's actually the second paragraph in the part. It starts with, but because I have tried to explain.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And then it's like, yeah, like I said, it halfway down the second page, but it's a very long paragraph. So,
yeah, thank you. No, that's great. Thank you.
No problems.
Just to be clear, sorry, I think, and this is what you referred to earlier, I think, Jody, that this is what he said he hadn't published to date because he was being super careful. So these are the conclusions he's reached, but hasn't published them. So in a sense, he's, you know, he's, yeah, this is his position that he hasn't yet publicly announced, I suppose.
Do you think he's trying to remain as a writer who gets published?
Yeah, I think that's the
Did he
point.
have a high profile?
I think it was a moderate profile by this stage, but he's got to. So I suppose he's trying to give a summary of his previously unpublished work.
Well, I suppose that would make the philosophical parts kind of adulterated by other imperatives, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So in other words, it's only half clear what he's trying to get at. Yeah.
Sorry, I want to go back because my brain moves. My brain moves slowly. You guys are way too fast for me. I'm still back at the bit where you're getting stuck into him about logic there, Judith. And I was just thinking about that. And isn't he just saying that based on these principles that I've observed, that God produced these laws of nature, and even if you had multiple worlds, it would be the same laws of nature here and there and everywhere. And at the beginning it says, after this I showed how most of the matter of this chaos must, in accordance with these laws, dispose and arrange itself in a certain way, which would make it similar to our skies, etc., etc. So he's really just saying, I don't really see how that's a problematic thing. He's just sort of saying that God rolls out these natural laws and the universe kind of happens as a result.
Well, but it's a bit circular, isn't it? You know, so at the top of so this is near the start of part 5. Basically he's established, or as he thinks, that I've always remained firm in the resolution I had made not to suppose any principle but the one I have just used to demonstrate the existence of God and the soul. Well, you know, it's not entirely clear he has demonstrated the existence of God and the soul. But he also says in a few lines further down that I've noted certain laws that God has so established in nature. Well, I don't know that he has. What is established, well, what is asserted, perhaps rather than established, is the arbitrary action of God in the world, not the laws of nature, because he's arbitrarily assigned the cause of everything to God. He hasn't actually, as far as I could see, adduced any laws of nature at all. But he's now saying that he has.
Well, he definitely doesn't say much about them here. I'll give you that, other than the principles, which which he laid out at the beginning. For example, well, he's talking about rational principles, but isn't he talking about another book, the Dioptic and things like that? I think he's referring to other works.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, he probably is. Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know what kind of natural laws or whatever that he's actually referring to there. But I'm guessing that he's saying that whatever natural laws he's identified there would apply in all possible worlds, because that's the kind of being that God is predictable in that way. If we understand how light works, we can understand how other types of matter work as well. Something like that. But my point being, I don't really see that as kind of problematic. It's just God as the first mover or something like that.
Yeah, so he is kind of just giving an account of what he hasn't to date published, I suppose. So yeah, then he goes on to nature as instantiated in animals and humans.
There's an
And
interesting comment about if we had, I think it's slightly further on after the blood stuff. I'm just looking at the time. And he says that if we could create a robot animal, basically, automaton, we wouldn't know the difference between them. But if we did the same with a human being, we would. I think that's an interesting point.
Where's that, Courtney? Do you know?
so you got the PDF, Jody? It's
No, I've got the, like Courtney. I've got the,
okay. So well, it's the end of section 56.
where are you, Courtney, with that? Which page?
Oh, he starts talking about it around 74, 75.
Oh, okay. 74, 75. Okay.
He says it is unbelievable that the most perfect monkey or parrot of its species should not equal in this the most stupid child, or at least a child with a disturbed brain, unless their souls were not of an altogether different nature from our own. He basically is talking about how absolutely different, really, human beings and animals are. Oh, sorry, go to 73. That's where he talks about it. He talks about the automata. So basically all that stuff about blood and the way the body works is where just this really sophisticated machine that was made by God. Then basically he says all the other parts which are in the body of every animal will consider this body as a machine. I just said this bit, which having been made by the hands of God is incomparably better ordered and has in it more admirable movements than any of those which can be invented by men. And here I gave particular emphasis to showing that if there were such machines which had the organs and appearance of a monkey or of some other irrational animal, we would have no means of recognizing that they were not of exactly the same nature as these animals. Instead of which, if there were machines which had a likeness to our bodies and imitated our actions, inasmuch as this were morally possible, we would still have two very certain means of recognizing that they were not, for all that, real men. And then he talks about what those two reasons are. It's quite interesting. Oh, he says, well, the first reason why you couldn't mimic a man with a robot, basically, is that they could never use words or other signs, composing them as we do to declare our thoughts to others. That's interesting because we're obviously getting very close to AI now, and that's what the argument is. Is it really AI, or is it just a sophisticated word processing engine? No one's really quite sure, but they're a bit worried that, because that's what he's saying, even like, and I think Sadler uses this comparison. He says even like someone who's mentally quite defective, they can still reply to you when you speak to them. You know, they can reply to you when you poke them with a stick, but the machine obviously wouldn't, according to this, understand how to convey its thoughts in this sort of meaningful way. And the second reason is, so it's obviously got to do with this cogito, this thinking self. The second is that although they might do many things as well as, or perhaps better than any of us, the machine, they would fail without doubt in others, whereby one would discover that they did not act through knowledge, but simply through the disposition of their organs. For whereas reason is a universal instrument which can serve on any kind of occasion, these organs need a particular disposition for each particular action. So that's sort of like saying a robot can be programmed to deal with particular situations, like you got to tell it what to do in each particular situation. But the kind of reasoning that we have is highly adaptive. We're able to apply it to every given situation. And that's something, apparently, according to this, that makes us unique from animals.
Yeah, this is like another part where just the cynic in me goes, oh, yeah, Christianity, because humans are better than animals. Because it's like, I'm not sure whether like AI actually could exist, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. And it's like when you go, oh, yeah, no, there's no way that can happen. The only way I can sort of rectify why he's arguing that is just, yeah, because the Bible told me so. Yeah, that's that. That's okay. Thank you. Yeah, but it is interesting though that it actually has this in the book, like, because I think the language thing is interesting too. Like, we can say at least that, for lack of a better word, the AIs that currently exist do exhibit language, but they don't have their understanding of it's just like radically different. Does that mean that they have human language? Like, well, they can interact with us, but there's not that experience that's going on behind the scenes. Yeah,
well, they don't really have understanding. They are just automatons.
Yeah, well, depends what we mean by understanding. Like, how do we? Like, there's one sense where we can say to have understanding is like the first person view of Shannon has knowledge and understanding of this thing. Like, if we have some sort of like where there needs to be like an experience behind it to have the understanding, then maybe it would always be that they don't. But maybe it's like a different way of understanding that doesn't have that first person perspective.
Well, it's still just step logic, so it does best when it's gathering process.
Yeah, there's probably.
Yeah, so it's not too bad, and for programming, as long as you already have an understanding of programming.
But that's interesting. But I was going to ask you guys, because I don't have a pet, and this one often comes up when you hear this argument at university, for example. People always say, well, going back to the animal thing, the animal can't use signs. Isn't it not the case that if you had a really good relationship with your dog can fairly well communicate to you, right? It can kind of say, without speaking, because he talks about signs, like a deaf, dumb person, the dog could actually indicate it needs to go outside to go to the bathroom.
Scratch.
Yeah, and the dogs can indicate that they want you to throw the ball to them. So, I do see a problem with that argument from that perspective. Obviously, the dog seems to be able to communicate.
Yeah, that's right. And
Is
also
your dog thinking what comes next?
Also, to some extent, yes, they are. I mean, they know what to expect in the course of a normal day. There's habituation involved. But yeah, they can communicate and they can express that they're bored or jealous or annoyed, or there's quite a lot of what we would call cognitive.
Gather information and present it to you.
Well, no, you're not going to prepare a proposal for a research project and And
Well,
then, yeah, no, but
Well, that'd be what's different.
But they could have,
but that's not what he says. He talks about it being able to communicate, sign, he even says.
so just, I mean, in section 6, Descartes, that is, seems to kind of proceed pretty quickly to basically putting out his demand for some research funding so he can do his experiments. That seems to be how the whole section finishes up.
Yeah, it really does, hey?
And Sadler reminds us that he comes to a sticky end doing his experiments because he went to some Sweden where it was cold and he was measuring, experiments measuring how cold weather affects tissues or whatever. And he got sick and died. So that didn't work out too well. But I had a professor at uni who absolutely loved Descartes, thought he was the greatest philosopher who had ever lived. And he was one of those people that think, can you imagine what Descartes would have achieved if he had lived like a ripe old age of 80 or 90 or whatever? But he died very young. So he's very, very intelligent. Sorry.
It does say that she used to get up the Queen used to get up really, really early. That's what I read, that she used to get up, and expect him to be teaching her at 5 o'clock in the morning or something. But yeah, but Sadler reckons it was from experimenting early with something else.
Which is quite dignified, really, because if he was living in today's age in the snow, he would have got cold, dropping his toy poodle into the snow while filming it for a TikTok video. I think we should kind of sum up now. I think it's been a great read. Is there anything you want to say, Judith, there? Are you looking for a final few things? Or?
No, it has been a great read. Thanks, Court. It was a great suggestion. It's been excellent.
I think it's been like the most stimulating conversation we've probably ever had on a reading. So that says something. And I got to say, I was blown away. I really like how simple he is to read. Like, he's so clear, but yeah, I don't like the consequences of the argument, but it's a very compelling argument to me. What do you guys think?
I think the discussion was good. No, the book's fine. It just feels very, I think you might have stepped away, Courtney, but I was saying that he feels a bit like when I watch debates sometimes, and there'll be like debaters who are rhetorically good, but they're not the smartest, and they'll sort of just go on this long diatribe. And nothing they're saying actually supports their final point. But then when they get to the conclusion, they'll be like, hitting the podium, figuratively speaking, and being like, I have proven this, this, and this, and this. If you do not accept this at this point, you are an idiot. And like, that's kind of what Descartes feels like, where there are moments of like, oh, like this is like going in an interesting direction, like there's flashes. But it's just like, it's just it's just like, it's so odd. And the other thing too, which I guess just to talk about the first section you read, is just that whole thing around the ancients and stuff was also very odd, where it's not just influence, but directly copying the ancients' homework. It's quite, yeah, but it was enjoyable. Like it led to an enjoyable discussion, so it was good.
Yeah,
I didn't read it.
It was sorry, go on. Oh, Kyle.
So yeah, I'll have to read it, I think.
There was some really good stuff in chapter 6. It's a shame we can't get through it. I'd love to do a bit more on it, but anyway, I suppose we've got to move on to other things. But there's an interesting section where he goes on about how useless volunteers are. There's a whole page of how he, like, it is true that concerning the experiments which may serve his purpose, one man alone could not suffice to perform them all. And so basically he's excusing the fact that he didn't do more experiments. But then it just follows with all this stuff about how volunteers.
But do you know
Absolutely. How he
you know-
can't work with them.
but
And
do you
then he
know what
goes
I
on about
found?
the cost.
Do you know what I found very interesting about that section though? Was it's really interesting. He's talking about doing experiments, right? But there's no standardized language around doing experiments yet.
No.
So he's actually saying something I think that's really insightful. If we are going to do experiments and build on knowledge from each other, we're going to have to either have someone running the show, or at least, he doesn't say this, a kind of formal language where we're able to kind of keep working on the same concepts so we don't get in each other's way and misleading one another. I think that's a valid point.
Yeah.
That's an interesting, like, because that's something that's like going on with like the experimental philosophy, which I think sort of takes it in a different direction than that, where it is like, no, we don't need to have these formal concepts. Let's just look at like, what does the everyday people think about like philosophy. But yeah.
And I also like the section after it goes on a bit. There's some really good points he makes in this chapter. He talks about cause and effect. He talks about the effects proving the cause. He sort of does this double back and talks about how if he can show the effects, he can prove the cause. You know, it was just an interesting section there on. Well, it's page 90 in this thing, so I can't tell you. Sorry, Julie.
Yeah, which means if his method works, that's what we were going on about before. If he can show that his methods work, therefore God exists. You know, that's kind of what I think he's sort of
if you
getting
don't
at.
follow his methods and you completely throw them out after doing the first step, and then just say, therefore God, it's perfect.
Well, if your science experiments don't ever come to any fruition, it's because God doesn't exist and the world is just in a dream somewhere in someone's head.
And he
Wouldn't
does
you have
say
to
that
go
others,
back to Galileo to sort of follow the thread onto Descartes?
Oh, we mentioned Galileo. He was in the background here.
Yeah.
just after that big rave on about, you know, the criticisms of the students of Aristotle, etc. He does say basically on the next page, basically that others could discover what he has discovered using his principles. So he's very strongly defending that idea that, you know, other people could arrive at the same stuff as he is, and it's all sound. I mean, when did the science? I should know this. The scientific method must have been established not long after Descartes, surely.
Well, I think technically it goes to Bacon, who was like one generation earlier. So between the two of them, yeah, they're considered the fathers of the scientific method. Anyway, that's probably a good place to stop, isn't it? So we'll have to think what we do next time.
Yeah, wonderful. We can discuss that. Obviously, since you love this so much, I'm not saying next time, but this is a real preempts us to be able to do the meditation of first philosophy down the track, you see. So it'll be fun. But I did have some ideas, but we can chat about that online and work it out. Maybe Schopenhauer, wink, wink. Schopenhauer versus Seneca. I've got two little short readings that really compete with one another. The On Providence against his studies in pessimism. It's like,
You're going to read them both at once.
they're not very long.
Good idea.
You've got two eyes, Carl. You just read one. Just hold both of them up. You just read them with separate eyes. It's easy.
Yeah, one.
But they contrast really, really well. So anyway, we'll discuss it. So thanks for coming along, everyone. It was wonderful.
Okay,
Yeah,
bye.
thank you, everyone. It's great.
Bye.
Talk soon. Bye.